Saints Row. For some, it's a knockoff of another well-known sandbox game. But to others, it's an experience that will leave many asking, what next? But you don't need to have played the previous games in the series to enjoy it, even though Saints Row 4 does revel in its goofy mythology. Beloved and sometimes hated characters and scenarios from the past frequently pop up. It's fan service, sure, but it also helps to flesh out the zany crew and their backstories. What was a DLC to be added at the end of Saints Row the Third became a standalone sequel, and now is hailed as one of the better parts of this long-going franchise. Following the lead of previous games, Saints Row 4 tells the story of the leader of the Saints, a friendly neighborhood criminal organization that the government now, rather than trying to imprison, hires to solve their problems, that to include former employees. In the previous game, Saints Row the Third, after fighting against a government agency known as STAG, you are faced with a choice: exact your revenge and kill those who stole everything from you, or save your friend Shandi, who is kidnapped and being used in some convoluted plan to frame the Saints as a terrorist group. Assuming you do the latter, this is where the fourth game picks up. The Saints, now loved across the world, are an entity, an enterprise, and are called to assist MI6. Agent Aisha Odekar, a new character to the series, and her associate Nat Miller, the former leader of the Deckers, an enemy gang from Saints Row the Third. The Saints are needed to protect America from a nuclear missile possessed by Cyrus Temple, the former STAG leader. Having gone insane from his obsession with killing the Saints after his defeat in Steelport, he believes the only way to fix the problem is by cleansing the country, killing Cyrus in a way that can only be described as a homage to Terminator 2. He still manages to fire the nuke. Left with no other options, the player jumps onto the launching missile and rides it into the sky. After sabotaging it and causing it to detonate, the player falls only to land in the Oval Office. 5 years after the events with Cyrus and the nuke, the player is now the President of the United States. And even while unpopular as a world leader, the protagonist is able to solve troubling problems such as cancer, world hunger, and whether you should punch a dick in the head or punch a dickhead. But those issues are minor in comparison to the battle that is soon to come. Many of your old crew returns, all serving roles in your administration, with new faces such as Keith David joining their ranks. With Shandi leading the Secret Service, she is the first to warn the protagonist about the imminent attack. The Earth is being invaded by the Zen Empire, an alien race led by Emperor Zaniac. While the player still has all the moves from the previous games and an arsenal to back up their smart mouth, the protagonist is ultimately captured by the Zen, along with his cabinet, and placed in a virtual simulation of Steelport, and must escape in order to have any hope of saving the Earth. The protagonist is then placed in a 50s sitcom simulation in the city of Steelport, where violence and foul language are prohibited, where you and a friend share a wife and all cars go a safe 10 miles an hour. The inhumanity of it all. But alas, Kinsey, a punctual and very clever tech specialist, contacts the protagonist and helps them escape the simulation, only to be thrown into a new one, a dystopian Steelport run by Zaniac. In this simulation, however, Kinsey is able to assist the player using resources around the city to empower the leader of the Saints with superhuman abilities. Kinsey continues to show her worth by helping the protagonist reconnect with their real body, which is imprisoned on Zaniac's ship. Disoriented and extremely naked, the protagonist managed to fight their way through the ship, slaughtering all in his or her way. But eventually cornered and still extremely naked, the protagonist is rescued by Kinsey and Vice President Keith David from what would be a premature end. Now on the ship of their own, the course of action is simple: rebellion. But as the Saints try to contact reinforcements from Earth, Zaniac destroys the planet and kills everybody who was not already captured by the Zen. The protagonist, enraged and now clothed, vows to get revenge for Earth by returning to the simulation to disrupt it and kill Zaniac. With options limited to guerrilla warfare, the protagonist moves on to save those Earthlings who are still alive. Each member of the crew exists in their own personal simulation, revealing their worst fears. Each simulation is surprisingly well thought out and provides depth to each character overall, as most were originally very flat and only meant to fill a hole in the team. While much to Kinsey's distaste, Matt Miller is the first to be rescued by the protagonist. His prison is a blatant ripoff of Tron, which has the player using battle tanks, riding light cycles, and navigating through a version of Mud with Killbane as the antagonist from the previous game, trying to kill Matt. Shandi's simulation has her dealing with feelings of inadequacy and guilt, trapped in a hell where she relives the death of her friend Johnny Gat, which she believes to be her fault. Upon the player's arrival, she is turned into her old self, a fun-loving drug aficionado who is really friendly and hates pants. After she is rescued, she is split into two beings, Old Shondi and Fun Shondi, both of which views vary drastically. Pierce, your oldest friend and karaoke buddy, faces his worst fear in his simulation, bad PR, when everything you work to build turns on you and tries to destroy you. Benjamin King deals with the nightmare of his old gang trying to murder him, and Aisha goes into detail about her fears of failing a mission and, in result, failing others. This game is not exceedingly well written, and will not leave the player with deep connections to each of these characters, but these rescue missions do help foster something that allows the player to care for each of these characters and relate. Sure, we have not jumped from one plane to another, or killed thousands of innocent people, but we all know fear. Fear of failure, fear of death, and fear of inadequacy. As the simulation begins to disrupt under the Saints' influence, Zeniac floods Virtual Steelport with copies of gang members the protagonist has faced before. Kinsey determines that the copies are from someone else's memory, in which the protagonist concludes to be Johnny Getz, who was thought dead. The protagonist, who has a long history with Johnny, demands to know the location of his friend. When Kinsey and Matt do eventually disclose the location, they also inform that saving Johnny would reveal the location of the Saints to Zeniac. Should the only hope for humanity be put at risk for a single man, it is determined loyalty is more important. The protagonist frees Johnny from attempting to save his girlfriend Aisha, where he failed repeatedly, only to watch her die every time. As they escape the simulation, Kinsey is captured, and we learn Keith David has betrayed the Saints. Upon returning to Virtual Steelport, the protagonist finds Keith has been declared president of the simulation, with motives for the protagonist to be killed so that Earth can be restored, as Zeniac has promised. But the protagonist knows Zeniac is lying. Fortunately, Keith later breaks the deal by saving the protagonist from the Zen, which leads Keith to being put into his nightmare of Rowdy Piper, yes, the wrestler, and tries to get Keith to wake up. The protagonist and Roddy work together to try and find answers as to where Kinsey is being hidden. The whole game becomes a lot more circular as you return to the place where the game starts. In the simulation, much like the protagonist's own, Kinsey is stripped of everything that made her who she was. Once freed from her simulation and back on the ship, Kinsey hatches a plan to crash the simulation. Working together, the Saints weaken the Zen's power and overload the simulation, managing to shut it down and throwing Zen's forces into chaos. The protagonist leads an assault on Zeniac's ship, where the two confront each other and the protagonist's new power that simulates his abilities from the simulation. Zeniac and the player battle each other with the protagonist victorious, keeping loyal to what was said of how they would kill Zeniac by ripping his head off. Impressed, the Zen Empire surrender themselves to the protagonist, who becomes the new leader of the Zen. The protagonist asks Zenji, the servant of the Zen Emperor, if Earth could be restored. He says that it cannot, but there is a possibility to visit Earth before it was destroyed via time travel. As the credits roll, there is a clip of the Saints dancing to Montel Jordan's This Is How We Do It, which also features Zeniac. Zenji also shows the many humans that Zeniac has collected over the years in stasis, one of them being Jane Austen. As a fan of Jane Austen, the protagonist wakes her out of stasis, revealing that she has been the narrator throughout the game.